People in the music and entertainment industry had to know that Diddy was like abusing, kids basically, and yet they still fed him kids. And like, where's the accountability?
There had to be rumors.
Elon Musk and 50 Cent just dropped something that quietly shook the entire industry. Not a press conference, not a lawsuit, not a viral rant. Something far more dangerous: perspective. Because while everyone is staring at Diddy like he's the final boss, Elon and 50 are pointing at something else entirely. They're saying, you're looking at the wrong map. Here's the twist nobody wants to slow down and think about. Diddy isn't being framed as the mastermind. He's being framed as the distraction, and that changes everything. For years, scandals in entertainment have followed the same script. One big name, one explosive moment, public outrage, then silence. But this time, there's a variable that's never been part of the equation before. Elon Musk doesn't deal in rumors. He doesn't deal in interviews. He deals in platforms. And platforms mean archives, years of private conversations, deleted tweets people thought were gone forever, direct messages from the Twitter era, now X, written at a time when no one imagined one person would own the room those messages lived in. That doesn't mean crimes, let's be clear, but it does mean context. And context is lethal in an industry built on image. 50 Cent has been attacking this from the outside, calling out silence, calling out fear, calling out how the culture protects itself. Elon sits on the inside. He doesn't accuse. He doesn't expose. He simply owns the infrastructure. And when infrastructure changes hands, behavior changes with it. That's why people are suddenly mapping this story like a pyramid. Because when you zoom out, this stops looking like one scandal and starts looking like a system. At the bottom of the pyramid are the names everyone is already arguing about, the faces that can absorb outrage. Above them are the gatekeepers, the people who decide what questions get asked, what stories get buried, what narratives survive. And at the top, that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the top isn't loud, it isn't viral, it hides in plain sight, and it doesn't stop at studios or boardrooms. Influence travels further than music. It touches media, it touches business, it touches credibility, even morality. 50 has been hinting at that layer for months, not naming it directly, but circling it, suggesting that real power doesn't need to party loudly, it just needs to be present. Now, before we climb, understand this. This isn't about doing a biography. This isn't about relitigating every allegation. This is about why silence keeps repeating. 50 Cent framed his documentary around a simple idea. When nobody speaks, the entire culture starts looking complicit. And the internet took that idea and ran with it. Because once people believe leverage exists, real or rumored, the fear isn't proof. The fear is possibility. The possibility that receipts exist. The possibility that context could surface. The possibility that private conversations don't match public performances. That's when people panic. Not publicly, privately. That's when explanations start appearing before questions are even asked. I wasn't around. I left early. I didn't see anything. Those aren't memories. Those are exits. And exits only matter when people think the building might collapse. This is where Elon's presence changes the temperature. Not because he's threatening anyone, but because for the first time, people know the archive isn't untouchable. And when people believe the archive isn't safe, the system starts to shake. Because systems like this don't run on guilt. They run on silence. Silence enforced by fear of exposure, fear of losing access, fear of being isolated. That's why Diddy matters, but not the way people think. He's not the end. He's the pressure point, the place where heat concentrates so the rest of the structure doesn't have to feel it. And if that pressure ever shifts upward, that's when the real panic starts. This is why this story feels different, not louder, heavier, because for the first time, you have someone on the outside attacking the culture and someone on the inside holding the data. And that combination makes people nervous. So the real question isn't, what did Diddy do? The real question is, who stays protected if he ever stops being quiet? And who benefits from him being the only name anyone talks about? This is only the first step up the pyramid. And now that Elon is part of the equation, the map people were using no longer works. The climb has started. Now that the map has changed, the question becomes obvious. Why does Elon Musk make people this uncomfortable? Not because he's accusing anyone, not because he's naming names, but because he represents something the entertainment industry has never had to deal with before. A power source that doesn't need permission. For decades, influence lived in closed rooms, studios, labels, boardrooms. If you controlled those spaces, you controlled the narrative. But platforms changed that, and ownership of platforms changed it again. Because when Elon took over X, he didn't just buy a social media company, he inherited an archive. Years of conversations, private messages, back-channel discussions between celebrities, executives, politicians, media figures, all written in moments when people assumed the walls would never move. That's the part nobody was prepared for. Public statements are rehearsed. Private messages are not. Public outrage can be managed. Private context cannot. And this is where the fear really starts. Because even if nothing illegal exists, context alone can destroy reputations. A friendly message at the wrong time. A joke that didn't age well. Support that contradicts later outrage. That's all it takes. And the industry knows it. That's why behavior changes the moment people believe receipts might exist. You see it in how fast people start clarifying their past, not responding to accusations, responding to possibilities. Because in a leverage-based system, the threat isn't exposure today. It's exposure whenever someone decides the timing is right. That's what Elon represents here. Not a whistleblower, a wild card. Someone who doesn't need favors from the industry. Someone who doesn't need access. Someone who doesn't rely on approval to survive. And that makes him dangerous in a way traditional critics never were. 50-cent attacks from the outside. He says what others won't. He mocks the silence. He dares the culture to respond. But Elon doesn't attack at all. He just exists. And existence is enough. Because when a platform owner controls the archive, everyone suddenly realizes how fragile their image really is. That's why this story started getting mapped as a pyramid. Because people instinctively understand that this isn't about one scandal. It's about layers of protection. At the bottom are the visible figures, the ones whose names can trend without breaking the system. They take the heat. They absorb the outrage, and they become the focus. Above them are the gatekeepers, the people who manage perception, publicists, lawyers, media allies. They don't argue with the public. They redirect it. But above that layer is something harder to name. The layer where legitimacy lives, where proximity to the right people makes questions feel inappropriate, where trust is assumed instead of earned. And this is where silence becomes powerful. Because silence at this level doesn't look suspicious. It looks dignified. That's why certain questions never get asked on major platforms. Why interviews glide past uncomfortable intersections. Why pressure always seems to stop at the same ceiling. It's not because journalists don't know. It's because they know the cost. This is the part most people miss. You don't need a conspiracy for this to work. You just need incentives. Access is currency. Credibility is protection. Silence is survival. And when everyone understands those rules, the system enforces itself. No orders required. That's why people are nervous now. Because Elon doesn't operate inside those incentives. He doesn't need access to entertainment. He doesn't need protection from it. And he doesn't need to be liked by it, which means the usual pressure points don't work. And that uncertainty is terrifying to a system built on control. This is also why you're seeing such careful language everywhere. Not denial, distance. I wasn't close. I didn't know. I wasn't part of that. Those statements aren't about truth. They're about insulation. Because in a pyramid, the goal isn't to be innocent. It's to be untouchable. And Elon's presence threatens that illusion, not by exposing anything, but by reminding everyone that the archive exists. And once people remember that, silence stops feeling safe, which brings us to the next layer. Because now that the pressure has shifted, people are starting to look at the ones who were always close enough to benefit, but never close enough to blame. And that's where this story gets even more uncomfortable. Now the spotlight shifts again. Because once Elon changes the map and the archive stops feeling safe, people stop looking only at the loudest name in the room. They start looking at proximity, not who was accused, but who was always there. This is the first real layer of the pyramid, the visible circle. The celebrities and power players who were close enough to the culture to feel its gravity, but far enough away to always say, I didn't know. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because proximity doesn't mean guilt, but it does create responsibility. If you were close enough to benefit from the environment, close enough to be invited, close enough to be protected, then silence stops looking neutral. It starts looking like a decision. This is why people have gone back and started replaying old interviews. Not to catch anyone confessing, but to notice what never came up. Questions that were skipped. Moments where the conversation gently turned away. Topics that felt like they were sitting right there, but somehow never got touched. At the time, no one noticed. But now with context, those moments feel different. Not wrong, incomplete. And when incompleteness keeps repeating, people start asking why. Because here's the truth, most industries don't like admitting. You don't need everyone involved to be corrupt. You just need enough people willing to stay quiet. Quiet to protect careers, quiet to protect relationships, quiet to protect access. That's how environments survive. This is why the same defense keeps popping up over and over again. I didn't see anything. I wasn't around for that. I can't speak on rumors. On their own, those statements mean nothing. But when dozens of people repeat the same distancing language, it becomes a pattern. And patterns are powerful, especially when the pattern is silence. Think about it. If nothing was happening, if the environment was normal, why does everyone feel the need to explain how uninvolved they were? You don't clarify distance unless distance matters. That's the part people can't unsee anymore. This layer of the pyramid isn't about masterminds. It's about buffers. People who absorb doubt simply by being respected. People whose presence makes the environment look legitimate. Because if they were there, the thinking goes, then nothing could have been that bad. That's how normalization works. Not through announcements, through familiarity. Over time, being around power starts to feel ordinary. And when something feels ordinary, it stops raising alarms. That's why so many people say, well, everyone knew rumors existed. Rumors are easy to ignore. They don't demand action. They don't come with consequences until one day they do. And that's the moment we're in now. Because when Elon changed the platform dynamic, the past stopped being sealed. Old silence suddenly looks louder. Old neutrality starts looking strategic. Not because someone did something, but because they didn't. And in systems like this, inaction can be just as powerful as action. This is why the pressure doesn't hit everyone equally. Some names trend instantly. Others never seem to get asked about at all. That isn't random. That's how protection works. The system doesn't shield everyone. It shields the ones it needs. And this first layer of proximity exists to keep the spotlight from moving upward. As long as attention stays here, arguing about who knew what, the deeper layers stay untouched. But something is different now. People aren't satisfied with "I didn't know" anymore. They're asking a harder question. If you didn't know, why were you never curious? Why did the questions always stop short? Why did silence feel like the safest option every single time? Those questions don't accuse anyone of crimes. They accuse the system of comfort. Comfort with looking away. Comfort with letting things continue. Comfort with letting someone else take the risk. And that comfort is cracking. Because once the archive feels unstable, once context might surface, proximity becomes a liability. That's when people start panicking. Not publicly, privately. And that panic tells you something important. This layer knows the spotlight is moving. Because above proximity are the people who decide where the spotlight goes next. And when it reaches them, distance won't be enough anymore. This is the point where the story stops feeling emotional and starts feeling organized. Because above proximity sits a layer most people never see. The people who don't attend the parties, don't trend online, and don't need to explain themselves. The gatekeepers. This is where narratives are shaped before the public ever hears a word. Publicists, lawyers, media intermediaries, quiet power brokers who understand one thing very clearly. You don't control the truth. You control the lane the truth is allowed to travel in. And once the lane is set, everything else becomes noise. Watch how fast messaging becomes synchronized when pressure appears. Different people, different backgrounds, and same language. I wasn't involved. I left early. I never saw anything. That kind of consistency doesn't happen naturally. It happens when risk enters the room. Because when reputations are at stake, the first move isn't denial, it's alignment. Everyone needs to sound the same so no one stands out. And the goal isn't to convince you something didn't happen. The goal is to exhaust you. Gatekeepers understand something crucial about public attention. People don't need to be convinced. They just need to be tired. Tired of arguing. Tired of sorting facts from speculation. Tired of caring. So stories don't get erased. They get delayed, softened, reframed. A serious allegation becomes a controversy. A pattern becomes a coincidence. A question becomes internet speculation. And once that label sticks, the story is effectively neutralized. Because now anyone who keeps pushing sounds obsessive. This is also where legal pressure quietly enters the picture. Not lawsuits splashed across headlines, but warnings. Carefully worded emails. Phone calls that say, be careful how you phrase this. Not threats, reminders. Reminders of access. Reminders of relationships. Reminders of what could be lost. And media outlets feel it immediately. Every outlet runs on incentives. Access to talent, access to interviews, access to advertising relationships. So editors make calculations. Is this story worth losing long-term access? Most of the time, the answer is no. And that's how silence becomes policy. Not because anyone ordered it, but because everyone understands the cost of breaking it. This is why the same names appear again and again around different crises. Same legal teams, same crisis managers, same no-comment phrasing. From the outside, it looks suspicious. From the inside, it looks efficient. Because this layer exists to absorb pressure before it reaches higher levels. Think of it like insulation. Heat rises, gatekeepers stop it from spreading. That's why accountability always seems to hit a ceiling. Below that ceiling, chaos. Above it, calm. People keep asking why certain interviews never get confrontational. Why conversations glide past obvious intersections. Why journalists who ask hard questions suddenly disappear from big platforms. This is why gatekeepers don't protect people. They protect stability. Because stability keeps money flowing, partnerships intact, and reputations usable. Truth is disruptive. Stability is profitable. So when forced to choose, systems almost always choose stability. And this layer is very good at making that choice look reasonable. They don't say, don't cover this. They say, let's wait for more information. They don't say, kill the story. They say, we can't verify this right now. Delay becomes defense, and defense becomes erasure. But here's the problem. This time, delay isn't working because the archive exists, because people are comparing notes, because explanations are starting to sound rehearsed. Once people notice repetition, it stops being comforting. It starts being suspicious. That's why the pressure hasn't disappeared. It's just moving. Because once people recognize the gate, they stop blaming the people trapped behind it. They start asking who's holding the keys. And above the gatekeepers is a layer that doesn't manage stories at all. It manages credibility. The kind that makes power look clean. And that's where this gets even harder to confront. This is where the system stops relying on control and starts relying on fear. Because above gatekeepers, above PR, above media lanes, there's a mechanism that doesn't need coordination. It runs automatically. Leverage. Not the movie version. Not blackmail in dark rooms. Something quieter. More effective. The understanding that information exists and that its timing is never guaranteed. That alone is enough. In systems like this, no one needs to be threatened. No one needs to be ordered. People adjust themselves. They stop asking questions. They soften their language. They remember things differently. Because once leverage is possible, obedience becomes rational. Here's what most people get wrong. They think leverage only works if something illegal happened. That's not true. Leverage works even when the information is embarrassing, contradictory, inconvenient, a private message that clashes with a public stance, a friendly exchange at the wrong time, a moment of support that doesn't age well. That's all it takes. In an industry built on image, context is explosive. And the scariest part? You don't need to show the receipts. You just need people to believe they might exist. That belief changes everything. This is why people start explaining themselves before anyone asks. Why distancing language appears early. Why statements feel pre-written. They aren't responding to facts, they're responding to uncertainty. Because uncertainty is the most powerful form of pressure. If you don't know what someone might have, you assume the worst, and you behave accordingly. This is how fear replaces contracts. No signatures required, no meetings needed, just shared understanding. Cross the wrong line and your access disappears. Your reputation shifts, your invitations dry up, and none of it happens loudly. From the outside, it looks like bad luck. From the inside, it feels like punishment. This is also where loyalty gets misunderstood. People say they stayed quiet because they were loyal. But loyalty here isn't about friendship. It's about survival. You protect the system because the system protects you until it doesn't. And when the system decides you're expendable, that's when things change. Every leverage-based structure needs a pressure valve. Someone who absorbs the blame. Someone who takes the fall. Someone who becomes the focus so everyone else can breathe. That's how stability is maintained. And once that happens, the rest of the pyramid relaxes. For a moment. But leverage systems have a weakness. They depend on isolation. Each person thinking they're alone. Each person believing everyone else is clean. The moment people start comparing notes, the spell breaks. Because leverage loses power when uncertainty disappears. That's why transparency terrifies these systems. Not because it proves guilt, but because it removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is the fuel. When everything is vague, fear fills the gaps. When things become clear, fear has nowhere to hide. This is why context matters more than accusations. Context reveals patterns, patterns reveal structure, and structure is what these systems work hardest to keep invisible. This is also why Elon's presence still matters here. Not as an accuser, not as a hero, but as a reminder that archives exist, that context doesn't vanish, that private history can resurface long after people assumed it was gone. That knowledge alone makes people behave differently. It's why silence feels louder now, why distancing feels urgent, why panic spreads privately instead of publicly. Because once leverage starts to weaken, control starts to slip. And when control slips, legitimacy gets tested. That's the next layer. Because fear can keep people quiet, but legitimacy is what keeps power looking clean. And when legitimacy starts cracking, even the most protected systems start to shake. That's where this story goes next.